Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week, we are going to get into setting boundaries, particularly boundaries around the holidays. And I want to start by giving everyone a disclaimer. We are going to be talking about Christmas, and we'll get into the topic of Santa Claus. And so I just want parents to be aware that if they have young ears, this may not be an episode for them to listen to. So
that's good advice. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I just want to get that out there now. So the greatest cause for stress around the holidays, I believe, is that we have a lack of boundaries set. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I think when you and I were talking before, I mentioned that right after Halloween, that's when our business just kind of pops up because people, like even now, it seems like Halloween wasn't that long ago, and we're less than 2 weeks away from Thanksgiving. And then Christmas seems like it comes right after that. New Year's, a lot of people, celebrate New Year's together as a family. And so it's been surprising to me how many people are negatively affected by the holidays. I mean, I learned that years ago because it's pretty consistent over the years. It's not like this is something that's new. Ever since we started in this work, it's been that way. And so I agree with you. I think the holidays are pretty stressful for a lot of people. And I think that's sad. And I do believe that setting some healthy boundaries and really figuring out what's best for your little family is the best thing. And it can really enhance your enjoyment of the holidays. So hopefully this podcast will be helpful to people.
Right. And so I want to start by talking about the different types of boundaries that you can set. Because when I say setting boundaries around the holidays, my first thought goes to extended family. And that is certainly the most difficult element. But there can be other boundaries that maybe we don't realize we're ignoring. So, for example, maybe it's a personal boundary. You have a hard time saying no around the holidays, and you feel like you just need to do everything. That's a boundary that you're ignoring. You're putting too much on yourself. Or maybe within that individual family unit, maybe you're not setting proper boundaries, or maybe there's unmet expectations or expectations that are too high, and this is going to cause friction. So I think the first thing to talk about is to be aware of your stress level, your intentions, what you want, your expectations, as well as those around you.
I agree. It can be extended family, but I think a lot of it's with friends as well.
Yes.
At least that's what I hear my clients talk about. But as far as the types of things that we might not be aware of, I think money is one that comes to mind. And you talked about expectations. And we think a lot of people have expectations around the holidays, like it needs to be big, it needs to be wonderful, whatever word they want to put to it. But I think what happens is the thought of spending a lot of money, especially when you may not have a lot of money, that doesn't stop people. And often they'll put it on credit cards, or they'll figure out a way to do it. And then come January, the stress is there. Although I think the stress is there even when they're, spending the money, because they know that eventually it's going to catch up with them. So money's one. I think time requirements, and this kind of ties in with family, friends, but it's also what you mentioned. I've certainly seen families where they think they have to go do everything. And, I don't know what it's like where you're living, but in Salt Lake, compared to when I was a kid, there are so many things that one can do around the holidays, and you can wear yourself out. You can have parties, you can have people, and you can become stressed just because, one, you probably aren't getting enough sleep. Two, you don't have enough downtime
or personal time
because you're always doing something. And often when we're so busy, one of the things that, gets put aside is one of our big three, which is exercise.
Yeah.
And so we start to ignore the things that we know are helpful in taking care of us. And so often self-care it gets ignored because there's so many other things demanding our attention. And it really does start after Halloween starts in November. People are already talking about plans for Thanksgiving. What are they going to do? Where are they going to travel? And I can't remember if I said this in our last podcast or just you. I was talking to a client, and for Thanksgiving, the husband wanted to spend, I think it was 5 days at a cabin with his siblings. Well, that wasn't going to go over very well with the wife. So it's that type of thing, and even to me, although I try not to make judgments like that, in session, but doesn't that seem like a lot? 5 days for Thanksgiving with your siblings in a cabin?
Well, I think it depends on the dynamic of your family. We went to Washington over the summer for 3 weeks to stay with my family for the 4th of July because Curtis works from home. And so he can do that. He can just work from wherever he is. And to me, it was fantastic. I loved spending those 3 weeks with my family. But Curtis said, I can't do this again. 3 weeks, it was too much for me, which is totally fair because that's a lot to ask. So I think it honestly depends. And I think it's different when you're the spouse because, yes, maybe to him, oh man, 5 days with my siblings, that sounds fantastic. I love my siblings. We get along really, really well. But your spouse may not feel that way. And I don't think it's fair to impose it on your spouse if that's the way they feel about it. Not that it's fair to just say, no, we can't go because I don't like your family or because your family bothers me. That's not fair either. But I could understand 5 days being a lot to ask if your spouse
sure.
Yeah.
I think we've probably talked about many times in marriage, it's all about compromise and accommodation.
Yeah.
And around the holidays, that's especially true. Like the number of engagements, the time requirements that are asked of us, the things that we want to do. Like I've heard parents say, oh, I want my kids to experience this, or I want my kids to experience that.
Yeah.
And often, we're overloading ourselves because we think it's going to benefit the kids. Now, I think that's great for kids, but they don't need, some sort of activity or some sort of engagement, all throughout the season. They're fine without it. And in fact, I really believe that the benefit of the season is the small little family that you have, that we all have. I think that's where we ought to focus first and foremost, and then you spread out. And I think often it's opposite of that what a lot of parents are thinking about is, all the extended family, friends, things like that. And often what gets ignored is their own little family, the parents and the kids. And so I think we need to shift that.
Yeah. So let me share an example of this horrendous thing that my dad went through around doing Christmas with extended family, which I think is a mistake. I think that should be very, very rare and very limited, the times that you do Christmas morning with extended family. So my parents agreed to have Christmas with his sister. And my parents said, well,
like Christmas morning? Is that
Christmas
what you're
morning. Yes. My parents told my dad's sister, we don't have a lot of money this year to spend on Christmas. And his sister said, oh yeah, we don't either. It's not going to be a problem. Well, it turns out they had different expectations. So my dad's sister was able to go out and buy some of these, like a few really nice toys, like some of the hottest and greatest toys. And my parents went to the dollar store.
Just so I'm clear, the implication was these came from Santa.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That was the problem. And my older brother was just old enough to understand the difference in this. I don't remember this Christmas at all, but my dad remembers the Christmas because my older brother came to him and said, well, why didn't I get those toys? Wasn't I good?
I think that is so sad. And I can really feel for your dad and your brother because, you get up and it's such a big deal. And it's like the disparity is so evident.
Yeah.
That sounds awful. It really does.
My dad said never again. And we didn't. I think there was one time after that we had Christmas with his parents, just his parents. So, my grandparents were there. And at the time, we were all old enough that, well, at least my dad's three middle kids that were with him at the time. I have a brother who's 10 years younger than me, and he
Mhm.
was too young to understand anything about Santa Claus. But us three older kids, we understood. So there was going to be no disparity of comparison
Yeah.
of what Santa got. I mean, those kinds of things, they're heart-wrenching. And my dad carried that around with him for years.
And I can understand how he would. I think that
Yeah.
would be really hard.
Yeah. It was devastating to him. So
Did it cause some friction between he and his sister?
I don't think so because it was unintentional. I mean,
Right.
I think they just had a different opinion of what lean times
Hmm.
meant.
Yeah.
I think it was a lack of communication and planning on
Hmm.
both parts. I think that they had come together and said, okay, this is the dollar amount we're spending, this is the dollar amount I'm spending. Things could have gone a lot differently.
Right.
And this reminds me of a conversation my dad and I had when Curtis and I were engaged. And we were talking about, well, what would happen if we all got together and had Christmas together? Both grandparents got together and we had this really big, fun Christmas. We all did Christmas morning together. What could we do? How could we avoid that? And my dad had the idea. He said, well, we could just set, each grandparent will spend X dollar amount, and that's from the kid. Anything else you buy has to be from Santa. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. And, the parties could agree beforehand, or I mean, I would think me and Curtis would mediate, okay, what is each side comfortable spending? But the point is there's a clear expectation. You've planned it out. So there's no, well, this grandma and grandpa got more than this grandma and grandpa. You want to
Right.
avoid that kind of situation.
Yes. Yeah, that's really important. But, as I was listening to you talk about this, that sounds like so much work. Just,
Yeah,
I
maybe.
mean, organizing it, which kind of fits in with the
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about, is is the work that we put into it really worth it? Now,
Okay.
that's that answer. I can't answer the question that,
Of course
but
not.
I think people ought to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is the level of effort that this is going to require worth it for us and our kids?
Right.
And then, base your actions on the answer to that question. And often we just don't think about it.
Mm-hmm.
What is this a good thing or not a good thing?
I would like to give another example of a boundary that Curtis and I had to set.
Okay.
So, after our first daughter was born, the first few Christmases we spent it with my parents because we were poor college students. We couldn't really afford Christmas anyways. And my dad, it was important to him that our first daughter have a good Christmas. And she was too young to understand about Santa. So, my dad, he made sure she had a good Christmas. This is his first and only granddaughter. He was going to spoil her, which Curtis and I thought was great. So,
Uh-huh.
around the time she started to understand the concept of Santa Claus was around the time that we started doing Christmas ourselves and Curtis was established in his career. And so, at that point, my dad said, okay, here's the amount that I'm going to spend. So Curtis and I were talking about this and we were talking about who's from what. And he said, oh, everything's going to be from Santa. And I said, well, wait a minute. That's not going to work. And Curtis said, but that's how it was for me growing up. And he even asked his mom, and his mom said, oh, yeah, of course everything's from Santa. And I said, well, no, that's not going to work. My parents want credit for the money that they spent. And it wasn't about the dollar amount, it
Yeah.
was about they wanted credit for what they're doing. And so we had to set that boundary of, okay, this is going to be from my parents. And it caused a little bit of friction. And we mostly had to resolve it between ourselves. I mean, I didn't involve my parents in it at all.
Hmm.
I automatically knew that that wasn't going to work for my dad. I knew him well enough that I said, no, that's not going to work for my parents. They want credit for what they do for Christmas. It's important to them.
So one of the things that we haven't talked about is because you talked about time, number of engagements, and
Hmm.
gifts, dollar amount of gifts. One of the things that we run into in our work is that often, sadly, parents don't treat their children very well. Parents don't
Yes.
treat their adult children very well. And
Mm-hmm.
really, it's just a continuation of patterns that, existed when the child was in the home. And often what it looks like is one or both of the parents could be critical
Mm-hmm.
and or say negative things. You have this idea, okay, it's Christmas time, should go spend it with our parents, but the person gets all anxious and stressed because they know that that same pattern is going to be repeated, meaning that one or both of the parents is going to, be negative in what they say. So the treatment by the parents to their adult children
Mm-hmm.
is not what it should be.
Right.
And adult children have a very hard time setting boundaries around that
Mm-hmm.
because there's this cultural expectation, I think, that we should do whatever our parents want. And I
Yeah.
don't, and I don't know if you feel that in some way, but with your own parents, or if Curtis might feel that with his parents. I certainly remember when, both my wife's parents and my parents are dead now. And so I do remember that expectation, though, whatever they want, we need to try and accommodate them. But I think that going back to what I said earlier, first and foremost, you have to think what is best for the family. And
Yeah.
if I'm getting stressed out because I know I'm going to be engaged with my parents and it's going to be incredibly difficult for me, I don't know if that's the right thing
I
for
agree.
the family or the kids. Sometimes it's siblings who treat each other that way too. And so just because they're our parents or our siblings does not mean we have to put up with poor behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the boundaries that we can set is around behavior.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking to, you asking if Curtis and I felt that way, I don't think Curtis ever felt that way because he moved out on his 18th birthday. He hadn't even graduated high school, and he's pretty much been making independent decisions since he was about 16.
Okay.
And so he's never struggled with that. I, on the other hand, when I first got married, I think yes, it was a lot harder for me. And looking back on it as I reflect, I think for me, because my parents were responsible for me and they contributed so much to my well being. I mean, my parents gave me everything. And even after I graduated high school, I was 18, I was an adult. For 6 months before I left for college, I lived with them. I was still expected to follow their rules. And so there were certain expectations that I had to meet. And as I got engaged, I mean, I was 19 when I got married. And so I
Mhm.
was still pretty young. And up until the day I got married, well, or at least up until, Curtis and I, shortly before Curtis and I got married, I was financially dependent to an extent on my dad. He helped me out a lot. And so in a lot of ways, I felt like I owed him. And
Mhm.
and in some ways I did. I did owe him. I mean, I remember being in college and talking to my dad and saying, am I doing okay? Am I spending too much money? And asking that because he was helping me out financially and I owed him. And so I think it was hard for me to let go of that a little
Yeah.
bit in some ways. But as I've gotten older and as Curtis and we are now completely financially independent, because that was another part of the problem too, is my dad was helping us out financially. And not
Mhm.
that he laid down these ridiculous expectations or we were financially reliant on him, but I feel like it's maybe, like you said, an expectation of we owe our parents something. And
Right.
to an extent, yes, but once you are an adult making your own decisions, you do not owe them.
Well, not to the detriment of your own either
Exactly.
mental health or the well-being of your own family.
Yes. Yep.
If there's one takeaway, for listeners, I really think it's okay to say no
Hmm.
to siblings and to parents
Yeah.
around the holidays. Well, generally speaking, but we're talking specifically about the holidays. It's
Hmm.
okay to say no
Yeah.
because, again, this is my bias and it's probably come out in previous podcasts. I think we should be focused on first and foremost our family that we've created, with our
Yes.
spouse and our kids.
Hmm.
That is our primary concern. And at the holiday times, often that gets lost.
Yeah,
Mm.
and it can be hard even as an established family of 15 years.
Yeah.
I think it
Oh,
can
yeah.
be hard to disappoint siblings and parents.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? At the end of the day, you have to do what's best for you and your family because as you said, that is now the most important unit. And nothing is worth sacrificing the happiness in the family unit that you yourself have created.
Right. And I just thought of another good takeaway. So there's another takeaway for
Okay.
this. And that is, I think in life in general, and especially around the holidays, there tends to be this move toward excess.
Yes.
Excess, I mean, if you think about excess everything, excess food, excess sugar, excess money spent, excess time away, not focusing on your own family. And so I think it's the excess in all these different areas around the holidays that is really troublesome for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so the other takeaway would be, pull back to moderation. Don't be excess in anything. So yes, there are all these wonderful things you can go do at Christmas time, but you also need time with your family at home and creating the traditions just for your own little family. The excess money that gets spent in the long term, it is not worth it. It's just not, because those material things get forgotten or broken. They aren't long lasting. And so I don't give in to excess.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember what my parents spent on Christmas 20 years ago. I mean,
right. It's gone from your memory. I mean,
yeah, I have a few memories of specific toys that I really liked. But really what it comes down to, what I remember most was waking up Christmas morning. There was presents under the tree. We were all together and I was really excited. That's what I remember most. And even as a teenager, Christmases that I do remember, again, it was the same thing. I just remembered it was about my family. It was about being with my family. It was a special day. And really, that's what I think the focus needs to go back to. So I want to briefly go over this story that you talked about on the radio for Therapy Monday with Frankie and Jess.
A couple of weeks ago, I remember that.
Yes. So it was this Mrs. X who had an estranged relationship with her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law wanted to come down for Thanksgiving. So,
what I would want to say is even the son or her husband, so Mrs. X's son, the husband has an estranged relationship with his own mother. That's part of it.
Yes. So they're all estranged. And so Mrs. X's mother-in-law says, I want to come for Thanksgiving. And so they said, okay. And they set expectations, which expectation is another word for boundaries.
Right.
And these expectations weren't met before she came.
So this has happened previously, like in previous years, right? And they said, here are the expectations. And the mother-in-law did not meet the expectations. So now she's wanting to come in 2 weeks was the story. And so the question was, what do they do? Now, because they've already gone through it by setting the expectations or the boundaries. And I think one of them was like, she has to stay in a hotel. I can't remember the other ones. Oh, number of days. I think it was the time frame. You can come only for a couple of days. And she broke both of those. She stayed in the home. She slept on the couch and for, a week or 5 days. So the question was, what should we do? Because there's a child in the home, so a grandson, and they want, there to be a relationship with the grandson. But I still think, and what I said at the time was, I think you hold to the boundaries, because one of the worst things you can do, I think, is set the boundary and then give in on it.
Yeah.
And I've certainly said before on our podcast that when you set boundaries, the person you're setting the boundary to will try and push back against it. That's pretty natural. Yeah. And I think that when you set a boundary, you should expect the pushback.
Okay, that's a good
point. And I think that you should have words ready in your own mind as how you respond when there's the pushback. And I don't think you have to get angry. You just have to say, well, you remember we talked about this and we set this boundary expectation and you didn't follow through. So, we're going to say no this time.
Mm-hmm.
So you can try it again at some point, although, this person is flying in from out of town. So that's kind of hard because the person flies in and they're kind of stuck with them.
Yep.
But, for for
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
time.
It was a one-way ticket. What do we do now?
Right. But I think just in talking about boundaries in general, it's important to realize there will be pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hold to the boundary, then typically what will happen is they'll then start to abide by the expectations. And the reason is, I would guess this mother-in-law or mother or grandmother wants to be with her son, daughter-in-law, and grandson.
Yeah.
And if she wants that badly enough, then she'll start to follow the expectations. But you have to hold to them.
Yeah.
Because you have to let them know, in this case, you have to let her know, we are serious about this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I agree. And I want to comment really quick on one thing I felt like this couple did well as a couple. So Mrs. X was talking to her husband about this, and as you were talking to them, to Frankie and Jess on the radio about this story, Jess came back with an update from Mrs. X and said, yeah, they decided not to go through with it because these expectations hadn't been met. And one of the things that I felt like Mrs. X did right, or maybe her husband did right, was he said, you can blame it on me. You can tell her I'm the one that doesn't want it, but you can tell my mom that I've said no, let's make a different plan, or let's try again some other time. And I appreciated that Mr. X, in this case, said, blame it on me. I think that that is so important to do to maintain good boundaries. I think it is so important to let the child be, I guess you might call it the bad guy in this scenario. Yeah, I think that's really
remember
important.
What you're talking about now. And I thought this was a really good idea that Mrs. X came up with. Let's try this at a different time, which I thought was a great idea, because what I talked about was holidays, we want it to be special. Even Thanksgiving, you want it to be stress-free. So what they're doing is they're going to try again the boundaries, but with a visit, say, on at the weekend. So if you don't associate it with a holiday, then if it goes badly, you haven't ruined Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Right.
You just, there's a lost weekend. So I really liked that idea that, not for Thanksgiving. We will try it another time, though.
Yeah, and you said that on the radio too. I feel like this couple has handled it exactly right. And I think, what it comes down to is they put their own happiness in front of the mother-in-law's happiness. And there's nothing wrong with that. People feel like it's a mistake to do that to your parents. And people might say, well, how could you do that? Those are your parents. Don't you love them? Well, yes, I do love them. But I chose this family. I chose this individual. I chose to marry them, to commit to them. They are now the primary
focus of the primary relationship. But so I think it's important for listeners to understand, when I talk about boundaries, I think when we talk about boundaries or expectations, it doesn't mean you don't ever see your family, or that you write them off, or that you aren't going to have a relationship with them. What it means is, this is going to be more on my terms, because it's better for me and it's better for my family.
Yeah.
And so that's why I really like the idea that they came up with. No, you can't come at Thanksgiving. We'd love to see you at this weekend, essentially is what they're saying. So we're still going to try. But see, in the message, hopefully it's clear to the mother-in-law, if you come through on this other weekend, then the potential is you could probably come for Thanksgiving or a holiday, because we know you can keep the boundary.
Yeah. And I'm imagining for Mrs. X, it was probably really hard to tell her mother-in-law no, because it can be incredibly difficult to hold to those boundaries.
See, the impetus for the question, though, was the guilt that Mrs. X was feeling. Yes, she was able to say no, but she was feeling really guilty. And so I think that's a common response as well.
Yeah.
To feel guilt. And often, say in this case, the parents, they do a pretty good job of making us feel guilty as our kids if we don't do what they want.
Yeah.
So we just have to realize that that's a manipulative technique, and we just still hold to the boundary.
Yeah. And hopefully there are parents out there listening who maybe realize that they're putting guilt on their kids and they need to stop it.
Stop it, yes.
Because it's not fair. It's just don't do that. I mean, respect your adult child's decisions. My parents and Curtis's parents have been really good about that, and it's made our relationships work very well. And I can't stress that enough, how important that is, and how much I have appreciated Curtis and I being able to live our lives and make our own decisions, and, our family not coming at us and saying, well, why would you do that? Or, why are you doing this?
That's really common, though. That's what people struggle with, is the parents then push back and say, why? Why not? You're hurting our feelings, things like that. Anyway, so I think the takeaway is it's okay to say no to siblings and parents.
Yes.
And pull back from excess.
Yep. Yeah.
Moderation, you'll be much happier.
Exactly. So next week, we are going to start a 2-part segment around teenagers. So we're going to start with teenagers and technology. And this is going to tie into cyberbullying, but we want the focus to be on introducing teens to technology and some good rules, some good guidelines, kind of what that looks like, because
boundaries again, right?
Yes, boundaries, because the internet is a very, very dangerous place for teenagers. All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.